truth. What is this? What is this thing out there?
House of Representatives has passed the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act by a 404-6 vote. 404-6 vote.
HR1955, as I understand it, provides a basis for subjective interpretation of dissident speech that allows those in power to criminally penalize anything they consider to be particularly effective in terms of galvanizing an opposition that might conceivably, in some sense, disrupt or destabilize the status quo.
The fourth possible definition of force was just as chilling. A body of persons or other resources organized or available for a certain purpose. And B, a person or group capable of influential action. Imagine defining homegrown terrorism as the use, planned use, or threatened use of influential action by a group or individual in furtherance of a political or social objective. God, the use of influential action in furtherance of political or social objectives. Though Bill O'Reilly didn't say terrorism when he called for the criminalization of free speech, Glenn Beck went as far as to call a political campaign a domestic threat.
On this program, we talk a lot about the foreign threats. Maybe tonight we should spend some time on the growing domestic ones. Well, here's the point tonight. While our foreign enemies are the obvious ones, the physical threat may be developing domestically as well. And here's how I got there. As I told you last week, Ron Paul raised over $4 million in one day. That's huge news. Ron Paul's supporters are tapping into something that's very real. It's something that I've talked about on this program for a very long time. The rising tide of disenfranchisement in this country. And it's coming from all sides of the political spectrum. If that feeling of disenfranchisement leads to political discussion, then our system works perfectly. But if fringe elements take that disenfranchisement and turn it into violence, we endanger the freedoms we're supposedly all fighting for.
I didn't want to believe it, but there it was. One of the most absurd definitions of force in relation to the definition of homegrown terrorism being played out on a mainstream network, calling a political campaign a domestic threat and implying that it could lead to violence.
Much the same as MSNBC's Keith Overman and guest Janine Garofalo do here.
Let's be very honest about what this is about. It's not about bashing Democrats. It's not about taxes. They have no idea what the Boston Tea Party was about.
That's right.
They don't know their history at all. This is about hating a black man in the White House. This is racism straight up. That is nothing but a bunch of tea-bagging rednecks. Violence, unfortunately, may or may not ensue.
Now listen to that last bit again.
Violence, unfortunately, may or may not ensue.
If fringe elements take that disenfranchisement and turn it into violence, we endanger the freedoms we're supposedly all fighting for.
MSNBC follows in the tradition of Fox to frame all dissident speech as something to fear because it will lead to violence. Nancy Pelosi, as well as the rest of all mainstream media, agree. Here, Cynthia Harding and Ron Reagan demonstrate.
I fear that we're headed toward a very racially polarizing climate in this country. Keep in mind the climate that we have just come out of, the climate of I want my country back from these health care forums, and these were not people of color. It doesn't appear to be about policy. It appears to be about race. I mean, we need to stop at this point, and regardless of anybody's political ideology, recognize the dangerous position that we are in terms of racial polarization and what that can mean when you take into account as well that a number of people in certain segments of the population pick up on that behavior and then they take it to the next level.
A lot of disturbing behavior, and you've cited some of it at the town hall meetings, and this is going off the rails, and I think that we work in the media, it's incumbent upon us to point that out to people, that this isn't just a political disagreement. This isn't just business as usual in Washington and the usual back and forth. Something very wrong and disturbing has been happening out there in the country, and we need to try and put our finger on it.
Claiming that your freedoms are being threatened by extremists is a manipulative and emotional appeal meant to distract you from the truth. And the truth is this: your freedoms are not a physical thing that can be bombed or shot or threatened by anyone in any way. The Bill of Rights is our guarantee of freedoms preserved, and the only danger to our freedoms is that they can be legislated away, and for the moment, with your silent consent. If bills like HR1955 become law, then soon your silence may not be your consent, but your only choice. And keep in mind, once you have no voice, you can't object to anything. I do not want to consider that the authors of H.R. 1955 actually intended these alarming definitions of force when they wrote the bill. But with these definitions being so clearly illustrated on mainstream networks, I find it alarming that 404 members of the House of Representatives would vote to pass such a bill without at least some clarification that there is not a window opening for this kind of enforcement.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.